So thank you to Alexander for the invitation. It's really lovely to get to talk about this. Unfortunately, my partner and collaborator, Anna-Sophie Springer, had to teach this week and could not join us. But I will use the word we and our to describe this, as the project I'm presenting has been a collaboration that has taken place for the last 4.5 years. And only last week, last Thursday in Hamburg, we opened the most recent iteration of this research project called Reassembling the Natural. But let's just start out with a little philosophical problem. So this is a photograph from a book called A Guide to the Flora and Fauna of the World, published by Robert Aranhui and the Institute for Critical Zoology. And you see what is a Sumatran tiger sleeping on her side in Sumatra, an island in Indonesia. But what's unique about this tiger, and the reason why she poses an interesting philosophical problem, is because she exists in a conservation area which is geofenced by a series of sensors. And if she tries to exceed the zone of her conservation, the collar, which you can just see around her neck, will give her a warning that she is not to leave that zone. And if she persists in walking towards any of the visitors in the conservation area who are there to see the tiger in its natural habitat, the kill switch collar will kill her. At which point, the workers in the conservation area will come, pick up the tiger body, take off the collar, order another tiger from China where they're being bred to be in captivity, to be put into the wild so that people can see them in their natural habitat in Indonesia. Artificial, real nature. Now, meanwhile, down the road in Sumatra, in the province of Riau, we see oil palm concession, oil palm in its full bloom on the right side of the screen. And on the left side, you actually see that they're beginning to terraform the earth so that they can plant oil palm in a way that might be more traditionally done for terraced rice farming. And so while the tigers on Sumatra are all but extinct, but for those that do a tiger dressage with their kill collar, a number of other species are threatened by the massive explosion of palm oil plantations. Meanwhile, in the Indonesian Institute of Science, there's a wide variety of Sumatran tigers kept in the scientific collection, but few on display for the public. And so what I want to talk about as a kind of specimen ecology is how would we begin to pose the problem of the Anthropocene, not only of animals with kill collars being bred in captivity for our spectacle and entertainment, but also the palm oil that all of us have consumed already today at some point, if we have been in the world, as well as the background and scientific archive of all of those creatures who have been killed and captured for our understanding of evolution. And to that we turn to the Oxford Natural History Museum, where as a sort of turn of the times, they have started to encourage visitors to touch some of the animals. I'm not going to go through my whole touching the animals photo thing. But this little guy, this little fox, is sitting on the desk for the visitors as you arrive. And it's cute, and all of the kids stop and look at it in the face, and we get moments like this. And what I would propose for this purpose is that we see this as a form of necroaesthetics. This is a fox that was alive, that was killed, disentangled from its ecology, separated, probably violently from its ecology, brought into a scientific institution, rendered into a format that appears to be alive, so necroaestheticized, because we know it's dead. It's not, no one stops at the counter and thinks that the fox is going to jump on them. but yet it's performing the function of being alive in its signaling and its posturing, but yet is actually a necroaesthetic act of the presentation of nature as something that can be disentangled. Yeah? So if we can think of this as a form of eco-terrorism, sort of psychological eco-terrorism, which convinces us that our specimens and our specimen ecologies can somehow be divided from and extracted from nature with no consequence in a broader sense. So we can return to Sumatra or to Indonesia, to Borneo. This is a specimen of an orangutan kept by the Liverpool Museum, photographed by the artist Fred Edwards. And when we see it in its form of a skin, as primates are kept either as wet specimens in alcohol, as bones, or as skins, in its skin context, it has a kind of particularly kind of haunting appearance. Yet when the orangutan is then presented in its taxonomical form, in the sort of staged situation of taxidermy in the museum, where then we have these didactics of how it fits into the series of great apes, we don't have that same eeriness. And what the question Reassembling the Natural tries to pose is, when we walk into a museum filled with dead things, stuffed and pretending to be alive, why isn't that really troubling and fucked up? Why is that image completely normal? The idea that we could tear these living things out of their natural environments and render them as contemplative, aesthetic, sensual objects for our apprehension in a museum context is actually really weird. It's as weird as the science going on behind the scenes, and it's as weird as anything in the ecology of strange ecologies. And so in order to ask that question, and in order to kind of push an agenda of why the image of nature, which orangutans don't look like this in the wild anymore. They look like refugees fleeing from peatland fires to escape plantation clearance. And so we don't propose to add that level of didacticism, but we want to ask the question, what is the image of nature that would be adequate to the Anthropocene in a natural history museum? And in order to do that and not appear completely psychotic to the people that we're working with in the museum, we need a strategy, and that is to appropriate a conceptual persona in the figure of Alfred Russel Wallace. So we're all familiar with the kind of bio-strategy, Darwin doing his thing, or Alexander von Humboldt, or we can think of any other, as a strategy for an exhibition. And so by using Alfred Russel Wallace, the 19th century British naturalist, as a figure, we can explore how the collection was both gathered and what its state is today. This is important because Wallace both was a key figure collecting in the Amazon for 4 years in the mid-19th century, as well as for 8 years in the Malay Archipelago in Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, where he also wrote the theory of evolution and co-published this with Charles Darwin. And so one of the key elements of following that is that during those 8 years in the Malay Archipelago, Wallace collected 125,660 specimens of natural history. An extraordinary number by any means, killing 40 things a day for 8 years straight. Which is a lot of stuff. It's really a lot of activity. But the question is, 160 years later, after publishing with Darwin the original paper on natural selection, what are the state of those two places where these specimens were collected in now? And so along the Rio Negro, we have by the 1970s, the Trans-Amazonian Highway, which has now carved the Amazon basin into a number of discrete little ecologies which are separated from each other by a number of highways and other infrastructural components. as well as in Indonesia, the explosion of palm oil plantations. In Sumatra alone, in the last decade, in the last 10 years, 25% of the island was converted to plantations. And so Wallace gives us a view into these two ecologies with all of the things he brought back, but also lets us ask the question about land use change and what's happening there now. If these were the areas with such biodiversity that allowed him to discover evolution in the first place, could he find it there now? Or what would he find? Now, Wallace is also important because he was the one making the designs for the Natural History Museum. This is a proposal from the Wallace Correspondence Project for how the public gallery should exist in London. But what's important is that you have to imagine the human walking through this gallery. And so to come back to the point that Jacob and Adam were making, that subject, that viewing subject in the museum, in the Natural History Museum, has a little extra. And that extra is that they are presented as the outcome of evolution. The outcome of the Natural History Museum is the human viewer. There is no Natural History Museum that does not adopt this narrative in one way or another. Of course, a spectrum of positions. But in the end, what we're given is the human as the top of that evolutionary proposal. And so coming back to Jacob's point and Adam's point, what's fundamental is not only that we are entangled at a macro and micro scale, but also that we're still visiting the places which, through their scenography and theatricality, present us as if we're the great outcome of evolution. Evolution doesn't anticipate things. It's a reactionary process. We really kind of fell out of the bottom of it rather than rose to the top. Now, the second point about Wallace that's important is that he's also, these are some of his original plates for Indonesia, he's also generated this thing called the biogeographical diorama, which becomes then the diorama that we're all familiar with, where we see all of the creatures of that particular ecology posed together, dead but as if alive. And so that image of us being as human viewers to come into the Natural History Museum and see all of these creatures posed as if that ecology is there for us to apprehend, this is also a legacy of Wallace. So I'm going to go through the renovation of a Natural History Museum, some of the artworks, and some of the kind of curatorial interventions. So we inherit the Zoological Museum of the University of Hamburg for this project. It opened last week. It will run there for 4 months, go to Berlin, and then go to Halle. And so in each of those, it's a university zoological museum. Into this space, we had to add approximately 180 square meters of new wall space. We had to add 40 days of renovation, and they were willing to close the museum for 1 day, the day of the opening. So we had to renovate a natural history museum filled with a lot of amazing stuff that we couldn't get rid of, including this totally dope model of the world on a chrome pole that just wasn't really working in with what we wanted to do. Really, an exhibition is literally putting a world in a box, so it's totally super meta what you're looking at right now. I also apologize for the quality of these photos. This is all just iPhone blasting from the last few months. We also installing live, so we had all kinds of strange attractors that were brought into the museum. This is one of my particularly favorite moments. Red lines are red lines. And then we were also essentially completely redesigning the scenography and appropriating graphically all of these biogeographical dioramas and then blowing them out and exploding them so that they were really kind of defamiliarized and denaturalized at scales that were completely kind of absurd. And so 40 days later, working with 15 artists, and I'm just going to kind of really quickly run through some of these commissions, but I do want to also bring up a point in response, I think, to Adam's remarks, where we are working pretty traditionally as two curators. We worked with the entire scientific team in Hamburg. We worked with 30 institutions scientifically for loans. Over 100 scientists were involved. But in the end, we were commissioning artists to make work either with us in the field or the archive, or in some cases on their own. But there was a very high degree of influence of the artists on each other and on our selections, but there is still a fairly traditional set of roles happening there. So, of course, one of the works we really wanted to include, some of you may know Forest Law by Ursula Beeman and Paulo Tavares, which looks at the emergence of the rights of nature, particularly in the context of Ecuador and Brazil, and the discourse around the rights of nature as it came to be enshrined in the Ecuadorian Constitution. And so when you look at this image, again, these are just the worst photos you could take with a phone. I believe the exhibition was photographed probably today. But one thing that I really want to point out here in this two-channel installation is that when you see it in its context, first of all, it's like sit down. Like stop walking around like you own the whole planet and just evaluating all of the things in the cases. It's like sit down and spend some time and listen. The other thing is that we brought people back into the museum who are typically only included if you can call them Indians or Arctic people, and then they get their own room where they're supposed to be kind of like nature. That's not even a joke, that's really how it is, right? And so we wanted to put people into the Museum of Natural History in the sense that people are nature and their relationships to nature need to be narrated back into this context. We also were able to include a number of works from Mark Dion, blah, blah. A brilliant piece from Shimura Bros from Tokyo called Chasing the Light about the transformation of the port of Singapore, where Wallace had first arrived into this kind of disgusting industrial pollutant zone from its previously sort of virgin coastline of tropical Asia. And then a really unbelievable work that we have published and shown before from Shannon Castleman called Tree Wounds, including 13 prints of trees that she sought out in the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where because teak was so brutally extracted from Indonesia for Dutch and Danish furniture in the 19th century, it's now a huge crime to cut the trees. And so what the communities do is leave an axe alongside the road, and as they drive by, everyone just hits the tree one time. So it's a sort of crowdsourced illegal logging post-colonial nightmare apocalypse, I guess. And so she sort of tracks these down alongside the highway and sort of collects them in their moments before they are crowdsourced to death. A Brazilian-based artist, Barbara Marcel, in a brilliant work called Open Forest, where she evaluates her own assumptions about going to the Amazon as a Brazilian woman. And here you can see we're using a lot of the vitrines, kind of taking over projection onto that space and really trying to not fall into the vitrine as a case where knowledge is enclosed, but really allowing those things to circulate. A few of the commissions, one that I'm really incredibly proud that we were able to support, Maria Teresa Alves, recently the recipient of the Vera List Prize in New York. We commissioned her to make a work in Acre in Brazil, where every year for 30 days, a number of indigenous elders from the region come to meet and share their struggles about what's happening in their respective areas of the forest. And she managed to interview 33 chiefs from different areas of the Amazon during this time. Originally, this was supposed to be a one-channel film, and it ended up being a 19-channel installation because she really wanted to show that Well, you wouldn't ask someone from Denmark and Germany and France and Italy to all give the same narrative of how they see Europe right now. We have to understand that the scale of the Amazon is such that many of these tribes have no relationship to each other but for their engagement at this time. And so trying to really show that when we say the Amazon, what the futures are imagined for that place are very different depending on which tribes are in the discussion. But the one view that they do have in common is to see the forest standing. Another commission from Paulo Tavares, another Brazilian-based artist, called Trees, Vines, Palms, and Other Monuments, works here. They both developed a set of films and a sort of media archive that is developed in participation with the Xavante community, an indigenous community whose land rights have been removed by the Brazilian government. And what they do is read the botanical history of traces of certain kinds of trees, vines, and palms in the forest to show the traces of human habitation inside that area of the forest as a land claim issue. And so this is now being developed as a request to UNESCO to recognize Xavante heritage as cultural heritage in the Amazon, not as nature. So again, a key imaginary for the West, the Amazon rainforest, being rendered here as a cultural artifact. Shifting to the other side of the world, we worked for several years with Armin Linke, Italian Berlin-based filmmaker here in Sumatra, again filming the clearing of land for palm oil plantations, as well as with the Drone Academy Indonesia, here training activists in Borneo how to use drones to film illegal logging and illegal burning. And we presented some of their documents here, rendered rather aesthetically and artistically, but these are all images that have been used in court cases trying to stop illegal burning and clearing of the peatland and rainforests in Indonesia. Revital Cohen and Tour van Balen developed a piece using X-ray technology looking at this very important collection of German birds borrowed from Errol Fuller, a British collector, and X-rayed to determine all of the internal structures which make the birds of paradise perform as necroaesthetics in this Victorian cabinet. In the end, it's a sculpture of neon, which is just impossible to photograph with a phone camera. It'll be online soon, or go see it. Also, working with Bick van der Pol from the Netherlands, and they became really obsessed and interested with this painting by Eugene von Gerard, which you can see on the left, because this painting in Tower Hill in Australia became the basis for a 50-year rewilding campaign to try to convert the forest back to the image that was included in the painting. And so they used this as sort of painting high-resolution botanical analysis so that we could rewild the nature to look like its glory colonial painting. And so in this two-channel piece, they really kind of explore some of this false images, or what we could say the post-natural or artificial nature of what we consider to be traditional and nationalist landscapes. Robert Zhao, returning again, who took the photograph of the tiger. In this piece, the Germans have amazing useful words for everything, including Nutzpflanzen. So the Nutzpflanzen Museum is the museum for useful plants, because Germans divide plants of their utility and those which are apparently not useful by their scientific classification. You're just there to look good. And so the Nutzpflanzen, of course, was an important colonial archive and institute in that it helped investors determine what products they should invest in for the German colonies in the tropics. And so Robert became quite interested in non-useful natures, particularly insects, as essentially the history of human relationships with insects is a kind of infinitely expanding war of chemical and petrochemical technologies and other forms that we try to keep them out of our stuff. And so apparently in Hamburg, the previous entomology director was what's called in the business a pest guy. And so he had all kinds of things that insects have trashed. And so Robert kind of did a sort of multi-layered, multi-vitrine room of all of the ways that we interact with insects and try to ruthlessly annihilate them every chance that we can, putting them definitively in the not useful nature category. And finally, it was really also amazing to commission and work with Julian Oliver and Christoph Wu, Berlin-based artists and critical engineers, to develop this piece, The Extinction Gong. The Extinction Gong connects to the UN Red List and listens for the addition of new species that are added to the list, meaning that they have gone or are about to go extinct. And as those species are added, it rings the gong into the museum and then announces the Latin name of that species through a small speaker in the back, which echoes through the gong and sort of rings into the museum. We put this in front of the wall of evolution, typically the wall where you go to celebrate how awesome it is that you as a human being can stand there above all of the other animals and determine that you're better than all of them because you can see all of them at once, but they can't see you because they're dead. Yeah, well, you know why we put it there. It also rings every 19 minutes for the most conservative background rate of extinction, the background rate being the normal rate at which things go extinct. Children really love it. Now, I just mentioned really quickly two curatorial interventions because we're also, I know maybe you will disagree with me, but we're also trying to produce a little science while we're in there. And so, of course, it was not just animals that were collected, but endless numbers of tropical plants being selected, evaluated, brought back to Europe, sent back out to various plantations to be developed for colonial products. And so working with the herbarium in Hamburg, we also did a display of 30 of the key colonial products that built Europe's industries based from Indonesia and the Amazon. Really kind of doing a long kind of historical work with them to kind of open up that archive and look at how the colonial plantation is actually the basis for European industry. And finally, because Sophie and I are both kind of like bird people, bird weirdos, the birds of paradise. So the birds of paradise exist only in eastern Indonesia and northern Australia. There are 39 species of the weirdest, most amazing, essentially crows, that have been left in evolutionary isolation for long enough that they got super kinky in all kinds of amazing ways. Alfred Russel Wallace was the first European to see them alive in the wild, and they're named Paradis apoda by Linnaeus. Apoda means footless. And so it was thought that the birds of paradise lived in the sky and only fell to earth to die because when they were sent back to Europe, they would cut the feet off the skins. So there's a little history of science, like don't believe everything Linnaeus said, you know? Of course, Wallace goes out and he's the first to see it live with his own eyes. He even manages to capture 2 of them and bring them back to the London Zoo, where they're put on exhibition. 20 years later, they're exporting 80,000 skins a year to London for women's hats. And it is for this it is said that little boys and women are the greatest enemies of birds. 100 years later, this man, who you will maybe recognize as David Attenborough, was just a cute little 27-year-old who headed out to follow the trail called Zoo Quest to capture the birds of paradise, both actually alive and bring them back to the London Zoo, where he's standing in this shot, as well as to capture them for the first time as moving image. So 100 years after Wallace, the birds of paradise are captured on celluloid. And another 50 years later, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology initiates a project to film in ultra high definition all of the birds of paradise doing sexy dances. This is the Semioptera wallaceae, the bird of paradise named for Alfred Russel Wallace, seen here getting ready to do the thing that animals do. I have 1 minute. So the last thing, because we should go back to the gut. Yeah? I thought this was so nice. So everything contains multitudes. This is the head, partial skull, top half, no jaw, bottom jaw, of a black Sumatran rhino. There are estimated to be less than 15 left in the wild, though some people have now said it could be up to 100 in a recent article. This is a property of the Zoological Museum, but it was sold to the museum by a collector who found the head in a dumpster outside of a army barracks in the Netherlands. So the Dutch military shoots a nice Sumatran rhino, chops off its head, stuffs it, hangs it on the mess hall wall. It hangs there for some time, giving them entertainment and pleasure, at which time it gets a little saggy and they throw it in the dumpster. Of course, they sawed off its horn first. The horn is now worth approximately 500,000 euros street value. And why is this Sumatran rhino horn worth so much money? Because people are now snorting it as a party drug. So I'd like you all to say, just say no to rhino horn, because that's totally not okay. Okay? Why did we scan the head of a Sumatran rhino found in a Netherlands dumpster? Because we don't know anything about black Sumatran rhinos. But also, we're not allowed to show the head in the exhibition as real because someone will steal it and try to sell it again. So even though the thing has been probably poached by the military, hung there, thrown in the trash, and then resold, it's still too valuable to be put in a museum on display. So we have to show it digitally. But in scanning it digitally for this art exhibition, we helped out some of our scientist colleagues in the mammal section, because what they do is pull these amazing rhinoceros teeth into an ultra high resolution scan so that they can understand from the wear patterns on the teeth what the nutritional requirements are for the rhino. Because you can't conserve a rhinoceros by telling it to go eat some bush on the side of the road. You have to know what it needs to eat if it's going to actually somehow be rewilded and not need a kill collar or like a Roomba to pull it around to the right food source, right? And so I think this is a really beautiful example where Professor Kaiser at the university and a number of colleagues in this computed tomography scanning facility helped us to really understand how what is the wreckage and ruin and sort of colonial leftovers, detritus of the Natural History Museum can actually be put to work through different collaborations and imaging processes to start to understand and intervene in some of the conservation processes which might work out better than a kill switch. And I'll leave you with this last remark that the tooth described by these scientists is referred to as the habitat interface. That the most lasting interface that we have with our ecology is our teeth. Because it doesn't matter what you eat, they're going to leave a whole series of micro scars at a micron level all over your teeth. And so doesn't matter if you did well on your diet or poorly, or if you ate this or that or the other thing, when people dig you up and have a look at your teeth, they're going to know a lot about you. I think the habitat interface is not only where the bone, the tooth records a relationship like this, but that the habitat interface could start to become the image of what the Natural History Museum could be in the Anthropocene if we could start undoing some of the ways that we're colonizing nature and put up a white flag and call it peace. Thanks.
Thank you.